So I do want to give a special thanks to the Adirondack Council for sponsoring this. It's been a really good series. And here to introduce our speaker tonight is the Deputy Director of the Adirondack Council, Rocky Adigri.
Good evening, everybody. What a wonderful space this is, isn't it? I mean, every time I come here to do presentations or be part of presentations, it's always amazing to me what an amazing resource the VIC is in particular. Thanks to Scott and his team here. We really are proud, the Adirondack Council, to have been sponsors for this series. We wanted to give a particular strong shout to Paul Smith itself, to President Dalrymple, the team here, just to really make this series such an outstanding event this year. I am here to introduce the speaker. Julia is the cap to this series. She's number 10, and it's been a phenomenal series. From Chad Dawson to Brad Edmondson, Brian Mann. I think we've had, who else was here? I think I wrote some of these down, but Jerry Jenkins, of course, Charlie Canham. I mean, these are thought leaders on some of the most pressing issues in the Adirondacks, and to have them here, and for Paul Smith to open up the space to allow these speakers to cover the universe of speakers that have presented is really phenomenal. I hope Eileen O'Donoghue appreciated my little space universe work in there. So it's really been phenomenal, and I think to have this evening capped by Julia Goren is so appropriate. Julia is a former coworker, a dear friend, someone who I think is one of the most balanced, knowledgeable, thoughtful people, not just as a person, but also as one of the thought leaders in the Adirondacks. Julia has really devoted and has spent decades working on some of the most pressing resource management issues in the park. She's been at the forefront of educating the public around the majesty of the high peaks, both on the high peaks and heading up to the high peaks. It was really encouraging and a wonderful sign to see her step into a leadership role at ADK and to step into the deputy director role. The region will benefit from that. We will benefit from that. The users will benefit from that. And most importantly, the high peaks will benefit from her role here. So if you all will help me in welcoming Julia Goren to the stage. Julia.
Thank you, Rocky. Thank you, Scott, for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out this evening. I'm going to remove my mask so that I can be heard a little bit more clearly, and if I can do so without pulling out my hair. So I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so speaking about the Alpine summits and the Summit Stewardship program, and a little bit about some of the visitor use trends that we've seen over the past few years. And before I launch into all of that, I do just want to say I am the Deputy Director of the Adirondack Mountain Club, and for those of you who are members of the Adirondack Mountain Club, thank you very much. For those of you who don't know about the Adirondack Mountain Club, please talk to me afterwards and I'd be happy to tell you more about who we are and what we do. And I want to just take a moment before the lights get really dark to particularly recognize the fact that there are a bunch of former Summit Stewards and Summit Steward volunteers in the audience tonight, ranging from the very first year of the program to folks who were up on the summits quite recently. So if you could all just give those Summit Stewards a round of applause. And I'll embarrass them just a little bit more by asking them to stand up. You know who you are, you're volunteers and Summit Stewards. Thank you. It is an incredible privilege to have worked with the Summit Steward program for over a dozen years with the Adirondack Mountain Club, and to be part of the Adirondack Mountain Club team now. So I just want to thank you all. And I also just want to thank my dear friend Rocky for that extremely beautiful and humbling introduction. I'll try to live up to it. So I'd like to start with a definition, because I'm going to talk about the Alpine zone a whole heck of a lot. I want, if nothing else this evening, I hope that you walk away with a sense of just how amazing the Alpine ecosystem is, and how amazing the organisms are that survive up there. And if you have been up there, I hope it inspires you to go back. And if it hasn't, if you haven't been up there, I hope it inspires you to take a trip up and visit New York State's rarest ecosystem. But since I'm going to talk about the Alpine zone a whole heck of a lot, I wanted to start with defining it. So the Alpine zone is the area above where the trees grow, where specially adapted plants are found. And these plants are Arctic tundra plants, they're alpine plants, and I want to talk a little bit about why we have a little bit of the Alps, or a little bit of Alaska, here on the tops of the highest peaks, how they got to be there and why they are still there today. So our Alpine zone, which consists of about 100 acres in New York State, all of which is here, all of it in the high peaks and up on Whiteface. Our alpine ecosystem, where these specially adapted plants are found, exists today really as a result of 3 different things. So the first of these has to do with the glacial history, the first of these has to do with the topography of this region. As you go up in elevation, we lose temperature at a rate of about, we lose temperature and we move farther north at a rate of about 500 miles per 1,000 feet of elevation gain. So I am used to doing presentations like this for college students, and part of what I do is ask questions to make sure that people aren't falling asleep in my classes. So I'll throw this one out. If we go from Heart Lake to the summit of Mount Marcy, Heart Lake's at about 2,000 feet, the summit of Mount Marcy's at about 5,000 feet. How much elevation do we gain? You can be louder than that, it's okay. 3,000 feet, we go about 3,000 feet up. So if for every 1,000 feet that you gain, you move 500 miles further north. How much further north are we? 1,500 miles further north. So if you imagine North America, and you imagine where 1,500 miles further north puts us, that's pretty squarely into the Canadian Arctic. That's Labrador, that's little teeny tiny plants and tundra. And so that is what we experience when we're up on the summit. So first you have this topography, you have this fact that as you go up in elevation, it's like going further north in latitude. The second reason we have an alpine zone in New York State has to do with our glacial history. So as you all know, this area was covered by a glacier. Those glaciers receded 14,000 to 10,000 years ago. When the glaciers receded, when that ice melted, the landscape had really been stripped. So the soils were gone, and it was cold. And the first plants that were able to come into that landscape were alpine plants. They had been carried south on the ice mass, that seed stock. So our alpine zone comes from Labrador. When we look at, we look a little bit at the genetics of where it comes from. And at that time, Arctic tundra covered everything. It covered everywhere where there had been a glacier. So that is as far south as Long Island was alpine tundra at one time. Certainly where we are sitting would have been a vast alpine tundra. And in the last 10,000 years, that has changed. We are not sitting in alpine tundra right now. So here's what it might have looked like walking outside our doors. All of this would have been this tundra. And of course, what's happened in the last 10,000 years is that the climate has changed, and that's good for humanity because it was a hard place to live 10,000 years ago. It's gotten warmer. Trees came up from below the extent of the glacier, further and further upslope, until they hit a place where they could go no further. And above that place, these alpine tundra places, these islands in the sky, continue to exist today. So there are many different metaphors for the alpine zone. They are islands in the sky, they are a living history museum, they are a window back in time 10,000 years. So when you step to the summit of Mount Marcy or Algonquin, or you drive up Whiteface and you take the elevator up to the top, you are stepping back in time and you are seeing this last little remnant of this vast unbroken tundra. It's pretty cool. There's a reason that trees don't grow on the summits today. And that is the third reason that we still have an alpine zone. So I'm gonna give you a quick rundown as to why it's so hard that a tree can't grow. So the first of the three kind of big climatic factors that keep trees at bay is the wind. So winds on the summit are very, very strong. I think probably most folks in this audience have heard that the winds on Mount Washington are some of the fastest recorded wind speeds on the planet at over 232 miles per hour before the anemometer broke off the building, the observatory. Here in New York State, our fastest recorded wind speed was about 147 miles per hour on the summit of Whiteface, because we happen to have the ability to measure on the summit of Whiteface. It could be stronger on the summit of Marcy, we don't know. Now, just to contextualize this, it's not the extreme that matters so much. It's not the crazy 200-mile-an-hour wind once every 100 years. It's the everyday wind. It's the winds every month. So on our alpine summits, we have winds that are in excess of 75 miles per hour every single month of the year. So 75 miles an hour, that's a hurricane force wind. So we have hurricane force winds up on our summits every single month of the year. That's just normal. If you live up on the summits, if you are a plant or an animal, and you live up on the summits, you have to be adapted for hurricane force winds to be normal, to be something that you experience all the time. You also have to be able, excuse me, you also have to be able to withstand the severe winds, the 100-mile-an-hour winds. Those are the kinds of winds that flatten towns in hurricanes, that level communities in tornadoes. And those also happen up on our summits every single year. Typically in the wintertime, but every single year you can count on the winds being over 100 miles an hour on the summits of our peaks. If you are a tree, that's a really hard wind to withstand. You can imagine a sugar maple in a hurricane. You can imagine how little bits of sand and gravel and little particles get airborne and they act as kind of a sandblaster on the leaves. Leaves get ripped away, branches get broken, trees get uprooted. That's something that's very, very difficult for a tree to withstand. So wind is a really important factor up on our alpine summits. And I point this out because this is the question that I get asked all the time. What about climate change and the alpine summits? And it's a very interesting and complicated story. But one of the things that I want to remind you is that because wind is so important, the story of what climate change will do to our alpine summits is not a simple story. It's not as simple as temperature change. Wind is really, really important. The second major climate factor that keeps trees off of our summits is the ice. So what you see here is a balsam fir that is covered in rime ice. And rime ice happens when you get wet air on something that, wet cold air that freezes on something. In this case, a tree can be your eyelashes or the inside of your nose or your hair, and it grows into the wind. So on our summits, and because of our atmospheric conditions around here, rime ice can grow at a rate of 3 to 6 inches per hour when the conditions are right. So if you imagine being a tree with 6 inches of ice building up on you an hour in a stiff wind, because of course the ice is going to form in the wind and growing into the wind, you can imagine how that makes these plants very prone to mechanical breakage. You can imagine how these tree branches right here are going to snap off. And if you've been up on the summits or you've looked, you've probably seen that where a tree is missing all of the limbs on one side. I like to say it looks like a drunken arborist has come and shaped your tree for you. That is a result of the rime ice loading. That's called flagging. So here's the anemometer up on right face with about 2 feet of rime ice built up onto it. So you can imagine just a little skinny pole right here. So it really gives you a sense. You can see those feathers of the rime ice building into the wind. In addition to the rime ice causing mechanical breakage, ice also destabilizes the soil. It heaves things up, just like it does to our roads. And because of that wind that we talked about, the plants, the things that are up on the summit, are exposed to the ice. Snow, which is what, of course, many of us think of when we think of wintertime. I myself am a cross-country skier. I'm really excited for some snow to come. Snow is a really nice blanket. It insulates. If you're under the snow in the wintertime, it's a constant 26 degrees. If you're outside of the snow and you are on the summits, you are subject to those beautiful March days where it's sunny and you're up on the summits and it's a bluebird day and it feels like a day at the beach and it's warm. And then having your temperature drop down to minus 20 degrees or 30 degrees or minus 40 degrees or 50 degrees that evening. So you're subject to these vast temperature swings. And again, the soil gets destabilized as well. So up on the summits, the ice is a very, very difficult thing for plants to be able to survive. What you see here is an alpine plant. This is Diapensia, and it is melting itself out of the ice. It is a plant that is photosynthesizing in this picture, which was taken in early April, because Diapensia can photosynthesize at 0.5 degree above freezing. So alpine plants are very, very cool, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So the last challenge of the alpine ecosystem is the soil. So our alpine soils are wet, they are nutrient poor, and they are entirely composed of rotting organic material. So what other ecosystem found here at the Vic does this sound like? Bog, that's correct. Thank you. At least some of you are still awake. That's good. Yes, the soils of the alpine zone are very similar to the soils of a bog. They're also very shallow. So what you see here, from plants to bedrock, you're looking at, in many places, just a couple of inches. At its deepest, in the alpine zone, we're looking at about 6 inches of soil. That's all that there is for a plant to grow in. It's not a lot of growing medium, and what growing medium it is not very good. So, it's a tough place for plants to grow. It's hard up there. This is a picture that I took in September. It's a short growing season. You got about 60 days frost-free up there to do everything you want to do. Fortunately, alpine plants are super cool. They are the superheroes of the plant world, and they have amazing adaptations. I could spend all evening talking about adaptations of alpine plants and still be really excited about it, but I recognize that that enthusiasm may be mine and not shared by everybody, but I would love to just share a few very cool adaptations that these plants have. So the first is in their growth form. Alpine plants are very small. So this right here is a willow. This is a tree. The giant pink thing, that's my hand, per scale. This is the dwarf willow, which is found in one location. Here in New York State, we think we have 2 individuals. It's it's a very rare plant, and it's a very tiny plant. This is fully grown. It's not going to get any taller. So alpine plants across the globe, and they are found on every single continent, are small. They're small because they can stay out of the wind. They're small because they need a less robust root system to support them growing vertically. They're small because rock reflects heat back at them. So staying small is a really potent and powerful adaptation in our alpine ecosystem. Here you see another willow. This is bearberry willow. So again, if you've got a weeping willow or any other member of the willow family growing around you, same family. This one is bearberry willow. You can see the catkins, classic willow catkins. It's growing prostrate across the rock. And then for folks who love some flowers, because who doesn't, this is Lapland rosebay. It's a rhododendron. So this is an alpine rhododendron. Classic rhododendron flowers. Here they are, classic rhododendron flowers. The stem on this, if it is as large around as your thumb, you're looking at an individual that's about 400 years old. So, and we know this because people have cored them, because they're woody, with electron microscopes to count the rings. So it's pretty cool. They grow at a rate of 0.06 millimeters per year in their growth rates. Very, very slow growing. If you live in the alpine zone, you don't have to hurry. You want to take your time. You want to enjoy being up there, and also there's not a lot of nutrients, so it takes a long time to grow. The second growth form that we see in our alpine plants is in the shape. Alpine plants, as I mentioned, are found on every single continent, and on every single continent you will find plants that are cushion forming. Cushion forming plants are an adaptation for alpine environments because together, we bundle together when we're cold. These plants, as they are in cushions, they create thermal mass. And so in this case, this is diapensia. This diapensia cushion is 15 degrees warmer on the inside than it is on the outside. That's pretty important when you're talking about those cold temperatures where you may or may not be able to photosynthesize. They are aerodynamic, so that when the winds, those strong winds are blowing, the leaves don't get ripped to shreds. And again, it's another way to pack that material in so it's dense and it doesn't require a large root system. So cushion forming plants, clear form of convergent evolution in alpine plants all over the globe, and we see it here. We see it in several of our alpine plants. They also set their flower buds early, and by early I mean 2 to 4 years in advance of when they are going to blossom. Now, this adaptation is really helpful because alpine plants typically have a very short window in which to bloom. They are the sprinters of the plant world. They're going to burst into bloom, many of these, for 1 week and 1 week only in June, and then their flowers are going to be done. They're going to spend the rest of the season and the next season and the next season storing up the energy they need to make those flowers. As I, again, like to say to college students, sexual reproduction is very energy intensive, whether you're a plant or human. All right, so here we see that same plant in flower. That is our Boots rattlesnake root. It is a northeastern endemic plant found in fewer than 20 locations in the world. We think we have about 5,000, a little over 5,000 individuals here in the Adirondack Park. Again, all on our alpine summits. It's a member of the aster family, so it looks a lot like dandelion, but it's a lot rarer than dandelion. Okay, and the last super cool alpine plant adaptation is that alpine plants have very cool chemistry. So this purplish that you can see right here, this is a pigment called anthocyanin, It is the same pigment that is found in things like apples and beets, but in alpine plants, it allows them to do a couple of really important things. First, it allows them to photosynthesize at low temperatures. And again, remember I said this diapensia can photosynthesize at 0.5 degree above freezing. So it allows them to photosynthesize at low temperatures. It allows them to photosynthesize in low light conditions. And it allows them not to get sunburnt on those summits where there's no shade. So it's pretty important for these plants. So I hope at this point I have convinced you that alpine plants are very, very cool, and that they have amazing adaptations that allow them to survive where we mere humans cannot. Because I trust that those of you who have been up to an alpine summit before have done so with a backpack on your back. And inside that backpack you will have things like sunscreen to prevent a sunburn, and a warm layer to keep you able to survive and respire in the cold, and a rain jacket for the rain, and some food and some water, all of which these plants have in their adaptations. So I have talked to you a little bit about the alpine as an ecosystem, and now I want to talk to you about why the alpine ecosystem is a really important and really interesting case study for visitor use management in the Adirondacks. Because, as it turns out, what these alpine plants are not adapted for is the traffic of human feet. They are not at all adapted for the traffic of heavy mammals over them, whether we have 2 legs or 4 legs. So I want to take you back in time a little bit to the 1960s. So this is on the summit of Mount Colden. And this is the summit of Mount Colden. This photo was taken, I believe, in 1967. And what you see here is something that looks a little sad. The summit stewards in this crowd are kind of, your heart's hurting just a little bit. You can see people have been walking here and here and here and here. When I say that the alpine plants aren't adapted for the traffic of human feet, if we were to go outside and we were to walk across the lawn that's out back of the Vic, which we would not do, but if we were to all go and walk across the lawn, we could walk back and forth, single file, in a line, and make about 500 passes across the lawn before the grass would show damage. And if you're looking at a college quad and you see those places where people have been cutting the corner, that gives you a sense of how many feet it takes to really destroy grass. Grass is amazing stuff. Alpine plants, it's a small fraction of that, fewer than 10, and that's going to kill these plants. So once the plants are dead, there's nothing there to hold the soil in place. When that wind comes, and you know it will, the soil blows away. And so what you have here is a place where the soil has blown away completely, leaving us with bedrock, which is problematic because plants don't grow on rock. So you have a situation that was happening in the 60s where people were walking all over the summits. Nobody was intending to damage the alpine plants. They were just walking and looking for a view. And besides, these plants don't actually look fundamentally different from other plants. They're just kind of small shrubby things, right? As it so happens, this is a story, and I should stop and say, and go back in time and say, if it were not for the actions of individuals, every summit, every alpine summit that we have would look like this or worse today. So if you've been on a summit and you haven't walked on the plants, you can congratulate yourself. And if you've kept other people from walking on the plants, you can congratulate yourself even more than that. And we, all of us, owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Ed Ketledge, who is a professor at SUNY ESF, a botanist, a hiker, and the first person to really take action on behalf of the summits and the plants. And I love to put Dr. Ketledge's face on this story, and I also like to remind myself and everyone else that a single individual can make a really big difference. This is the face of the person who saved our Alpine summits. And all of us have the power to save other ecosystems and other organisms as well. So Dr. Ketledge was up on the summits. He noticed that these plants were literally being walked into oblivion, not through malice, but simply through a lack of education, and he decided to do something about it. So, being a researcher, he conducted some research up there. He conducted some experiments, and the first thing that he did was he tried to transplant alpine plants. And he learned a really interesting lesson, which has been replicated, which is that alpine plants don't like to be transplanted. They don't do well as transplants. So there are evidence of pin flagging right here where there were transplants that didn't succeed. The next thing that he tried was trying to get something that would stabilize the soil. So what you see up here, patch 1, this is throwing down grass seed. And what you see is that the grass did not like, right here is our grass seed. Grass did not like growing in that alpine soil. It's very acidic, it's very wet, it's very nutrient poor. And as we know, that's not the way that most lawns like to grow. What you see here is a patch of sod that is red fescue and Kentucky bluegrass, which is the same kind of mix that you would find in any lawn. But what made it grow was the addition of fertilizer and lime. And I hope that you are thinking to yourself, oh my God, that's somebody bringing invasive plant species into a fragile ecosystem. Because you're absolutely right. It's a horrifying thought. As it so happened, it worked really, really well. The grass was able to grow. It did not survive without the fertilizer and the lime, which disappeared over time. And in fact, I have myself scoured the summits looking for Kentucky bluegrass and red fescue and have never found even a single blade of it. But what it did do was hold the soil in place long enough to allow the alpine plants to come back. So this was pretty amazing. Now, as it so happens, the problem wasn't the plants, right? The problem was the people. And so to change what was happening, you needed to change the people's behavior. And this is where the Summit Steward program comes into play. So the Summit Stewardship program is a partnership of the Adirondack Mountain Club, the Adirondack Chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. And our job is to protect New York State's alpine habitat through education, which we do by talking to people. I should have asked before, how many of you have met a summit steward on a summit before? Could you stick up your hands? That's a lot of you, that's awesome. So our job as summit stewards is to talk to everyone who comes up onto the summit, to ask them to help protect the alpine ecosystem by walking on the rocks and not on the plants, and to invest them with a sense of what makes this ecosystem so special and enlist their help as stewards. The second thing that summit stewards do is trail work. They build cairns, which is the rock trail marker that you see right here. They stabilize the soil, they mark the trail with scree wall. The third component of what summit stewards do is research. And I'll talk a little bit about a couple of the research projects, and I would like to just thank Ryan, whose picture is not in this show for doing plant research, but he has been doing plant research or has done plant research in the past. Here you see summit stewards who are conducting a population census to get a sense of how alpine plant populations of our rare plants are doing on the summits. So the program that I want to talk about, the research project I want to talk about very briefly, is our photo point monitoring project, which is a repeat photography study that uses repeat photography to look and see how things are changing on the summits over time. I'm going to show you an example series This is the summit of Mount Marcy. This photo is taken in 1992. And I love showing this one because there's this nice rock wall that was built by summit stewards. And rocks don't get up and walk away on their own, just so you all know, in case you were wondering. So here's that same area in 99, and here's that rock wall again. Here's what that area looked in 2004. Here are those rocks. In 2009, in 2011, and in 2015. You guys forgot that's where you're supposed to say, ooh. Okay, yeah, I know, I'm a little bit cheesy. I have a 7-year-old, I can be goofy like this, I'm allowed. So, here we go, Alpine summits. I'll go back in time, just so we can look again. Here it is, it's all muddy. Thank you, that makes me feel better. Okay, so what we did was we analyzed these photos. We analyzed these photos to see what was happening over time. And what we saw was that alpine plants are recovering. And that's really good. Alpine plants are recovering. And not only are alpine plants recovering, but they're recovering differently on peaks that have a summit steward versus peaks that don't have a summit steward. So that's what you see here comparing, looking over time. You can see that stewarded peaks are recovering better than peaks without a summit steward, which are essentially remaining flat. Now, one of the other things that is interesting is that in between this 2009 photo and this 2009 data point and this 2015 data point, something interesting happened in terms of the number of visitors. And in 2011, we started to see a really substantial increase, and in fact, an exponential increase in the number of visitors that summit stewards were encountering on the summits. So one of the things that I find incredibly promising and incredibly hopeful is that even in light of this exponential increase in the number of visitors, we can see that things are still continuing to improve. So the summits, that suggests that the presence of an educator, the summit stewards, is still managing to protect these ecosystems, even though we're seeing this really dramatic increase. So for over 30 years, summit stewards have been protecting the alpine ecosystem. And it is thanks to all of you who've been up there that these plants are recovering. And it is thanks to all of you and what you do in the future that these plants continue to recover. But I have this feeling that many of you came this evening not because you wanted to hear me talk about the cool work of the Summit Steward program of the past, but maybe because you wanted to know what's been going on the past couple of years with visitor use trends. And I myself really like to geek out over visitor use and particularly what's been happening recently. So I wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about what's been happening. So who went for a hike in 2020 on a summit and saw a whole bunch of people? Yeah, there were a lot of people. There were a lot of people out there in 2020. In fact, what we saw was a really big increase in the average number of hikers per day. So here's 2020. What you see is that's pretty darn high. 2019 also really, really high compared to the beginning of the program where our average number of hikers per day was more around 60. There we're talking 100 or more people per day. We saw a lot of hikers, and I want to talk a little bit about some things that we know. And I'm going to try not to delve too much into the realm of speculation, but here are a couple things we know about the crowds that were coming in 2020. First, we know that about 18 to 20% of those hikers were coming here because of the pandemic. They weren't going someplace else. And we know that thanks to work that was done by the Adirondack Council, by Dr. Jill Weiss of SUNY ESF, and also by researchers from the Wildlife Conservation Society and Paul Smiths, including Dr. McKaylee Lennon, who's in the audience right now, and I hope she'll correct me if I get any of this wrong. But from those survey results, we know a bunch of these people were coming to the High Peaks for the first time because they weren't going someplace else. We also know that there were no Canadians because the border's been closed. And Canadian visitors make up a pretty large percentage of our typical audience. We saw a pretty flat overall number, which suggests that that 18 to 20% was completely making up for all of the missing Canadians. We also know that 2020 was a beautiful summer. It was sunny, it was gorgeous, and many people had nowhere else to go. Travel restrictions made it very difficult to go places. So not surprisingly, people felt safe in the out of doors, and one of the places they came was to hike in the high peaks of the Adirondacks. It was a big deal. There were a lot of people. Now, this is that same average number of hikers per day with the 2021 number. And we see this huge drop off. Wow, like way down. So as a matter of fact, when I did some crunching of numbers, this is putting us like all the way back to here, to the early 2000s to 2008 in terms of the number of visitors per day. It was a substantial decline. Here's some things that we knew about this past summer. There were fewer hikers overall. We know that at the Adirondack Mountain Club from the number of hikers that we encountered on the summits, from the number of days that our parking lot filled, from the time of day that our parking lot filled, all of the different ways we can count it, there were fewer hikers. There were still no Canadians. So again, that's that typical like 20%, 20 to 30% of hikers that would be Canadian. They weren't here. We also know it was wet. It was a wet summer. And typically when we have a wet summer, we see a decline in the number of hikers. That's kind of common sense. Some folks out there are wet weather, all weather hikers, and some folks out there are fair weather, sunny weather hikers. There was also a loosening of pandemic restrictions, and so people had other places to travel. They had other places to go. And then I want to just touch on a couple of anecdotes that we've heard. Over the course of the summer, we had people show up at the Adirondack Lodge with their permit to go hiking in hand. Yeah, I hear some of you chuckling. You don't need a permit to go hiking at the Adirondack Lodge. You need a permit to go hiking at the Adirondack Mountain Reserve. So there was a bit of confusion around the permit system. Some folks, so we heard that at ADK, folks from the DEC also heard that. So there was a bit of confusion, and that may have reduced the number of hikers. Similarly, there was a shuttle service. There was a shuttle service that wasn't going to run, then it was going to run, but there was a lot of general public confusion about that. And some of these kind of mixed educational messages may have had people go to other places because they didn't know what they could do. And then lastly, just the last point that I will say is that I went back in time for another wet summer, for a summer that was as wet as the summer of 2020. And I happen to remember the summer of 2013 being just as wet because we were out surveying plants, and it was a wet, miserable summer for that work, or a wet, fantastic summer for that work, depending on your point of view. When you compare our numbers from this past summer to 2013, roughly analogous weather, there's about a 20% difference, which accounts for those Canadian visitors who weren't here this summer. So it gives you a sense of kind of what we were on par with. So, what does this all mean? First and foremost, there is a need for education. People always have a need to know about this place, and for that messaging to be really clear. In order to protect the summits and continue to protect the summits, we have a need for practicing responsible recreation, for practicing leave no trace. There is an incredible opportunity for people to come to the summits and to come to this place and to fall in love with it and to become new stewards of the land. And I would not be surprised if I asked to find out that many of you have that story yourself, of having come and having hiked and having fallen in love with this place and now being here to help protect it. I sure do. And last but not least, because we know we have a lot of visitors, and we want to make sure that they have a good experience and that they help protect this place so that others can have a good experience, whether they're a diapensia or a Bicknell's thrush, which is an Alpine-loving, it's a Krumholtz-loving bird, or whether they're a hiker. We need some visitor use management, and we need it to think comprehensively about the high peaks of the Adirondacks and the Adirondack Park in general. So with that, I want to draw your attention to some of the things that are out there that are happening and give you some opportunities for engaging. So the first thing is, and I apologize for all the acronyms in here, the High Peaks Advisory Group, which published its report the very end of last year, Rocky, or was it January? Yes, somewhere. It published a report, and if you are interested in reading that report and you haven't done so, you can find it. It is online. It is online through links from the Adirondack Council's website, the Adirondack Mountain Club's website, and the Department of Environmental Conservation's website. It calls for, among other things, comprehensive visitor use management and using visitor use management framework so that we can do a good job of planning for this region so it will continue to be a good experience for people, for the wilderness, for the ecosystems into the future. There's all this cool research that's happening right now. I mentioned 2 research projects that were taking place in the summer of 2020. 2 of those research projects are still taking place, or were still taking place this past summer. The work by the Wildlife Conservation Society and the work of Dr. Jill Weiss through that larger effort. Those are really cool projects that will help us understand more about users in this area. In addition to that, the Adirondack Council was working in partnership with a research firm to look at how visitors are flowing through the high peaks, how much, where they're encountering other visitors, and help us understand how is this system working. And this is really important because you cannot manage for the visitors, for the experience, for the ecosystems, if you don't understand it. So this research is really important. And then the last piece that I want to just draw your attention to is the fact that the Adirondack Park Agency and the Department of Environmental Conservation are trying hard to come up with their own way of thinking about visitor use management. And so there's an opportunity to if you're into commenting through comment letters, there's an opportunity to comment on the visitor use management and wildlands monitoring protocol document. I know, I threw a bunch of acronyms up there. Sorry. Okay. We need some things to be successful in the future. We need an investment in sustainable trails. We need an investment in education. We need an investment in planning, in infrastructure, and in staff. We need decisions that are based on research. And we need decisions that respond to what the research tells us. In the meantime, thanks to the Summit Stewards, who have been, since the beginning of the program, spoken with over 600,000 visitors and helped protect our Alpine summits. Thank you for helping to protect the summits by doing the rock walk, by practicing Leave No Trace and sharing the message to other people that you encounter, by volunteering, and by donating. And if you're interested in learning more about the Summit Steward program, about the Adirondack Mountain Club, or just want to talk more about visitor use management, I would love to try to answer questions.
they go around burning the tops of the mountains years ago. I once read that somebody, that was their reason for being, is they would go to the peaks and burn off the tops.
Yeah, so the question was whether or not the peaks had been, the summits had been burned off. And the answer to that question is yes, but not our Alpine summits. And the person who did that was actually Verplank Colvin, who was burning those trees out of the way so that he could do the measurements on the heights of the mountains. So that's the reason, for example, that Ampersand has a bare summit. That is because of Verplank Colvin having burnt the summit free of vegetation so that he could use it for surveying.
How many summits are summit stewards on currently in the summer season?
So the question was how many summits have summit stewards on them in the summer. So summit stewards cover Mount Marcy and Algonquin, which are the two peaks that have the vast majority of the alpine habitat. They cover those peaks 7 days a week. They cover Wright Peak 5 days a week. They cover Cascade in the pre-pandemic times. They covered Cascade every single weekend, and Colden about every other week. In addition to that, this past year, the Summit Steward program partnered with the Friends of Hurricane, and so Summit Stewards were over on Hurricane as well, and there were Friends of Hurricane who worked with some of the Summit Stewards. And it's it's a crew of 5 paid folks, one of whom runs the program. And is responsible for coordinating all the research and the schedules and managing the gear and all of that, and then a host of incredible volunteers who do it because they love it. Yeah.
How do you become a steward?
Oh, yes. If you're interested in becoming a summit steward, first of all, if you're interested in becoming part of our paid crew, the deadline to apply is always February 1st. You can find out more on our website under adk.org, look at job opportunities, and you can also email Kayla, Kaylaw, at adk.org. And if you're interested in becoming a volunteer, you can also email Kayla, but you don't have to do it by February 1st. You can do it anytime. Jamie.
That was very thought-provoking. Thank you. You mentioned sustainable trails, that we need more, and I agree with that. But so I'm wondering, though, if you know of anybody doing research on sustainable trails, because it seems like one of the solutions to make a trail sustainable is the rock steps that we're seeing more and more of, rock staircases being built. But what I see are people specifically avoiding those sometimes. So is anybody doing research in terms of what's sort of acceptable? There's what's sustainable from an ecological standpoint, and then there's what's acceptable to the users. And maybe those steps are too high, or maybe they're too slippery, or maybe we need to look at other solutions. Is anybody doing that kind of research?
Yeah, Jamie, that's a great question. So the question, just in case everybody couldn't hear, the question was about sustainable trails and whether or not people are doing research on whether users will use rock staircases, for example, which are a sustainable trail because those surfaces are durable and they don't erode. So the answer is yes. First of all, some of the work being done is being done by Dr. Jeff Marion at Virginia Tech. Here in the Adirondacks, we're seeing a new style of staircase, rock staircase being built. So if you go hike on Mount Van Hovenberg, for example, you're seeing state-of-the-art, and not just state-of-the-art in the Adirondacks. I want to emphasize this. The Mount Van Hovenberg East Trail is state-of-the-art in the country in terms of the rock building techniques. The principal trail builder that has been working under contract from the state is Tawas Trails, which has won awards from the Professional Trail Builders Association in this country for the outstanding quality of their rock work specifically. So they're building rock stairs that have the same rise and run as a wooden staircase in your house, for particularly that reason that you mentioned, Jamie. If we make those rock stairs too big, people won't walk on them. It's too much. People will walk around them. So if we do a staircase that is, I believe, a 7-inch, no more than a 7-inch step up, then people will stay on that. There are also other ways that the trail builders are using to essentially place other objects around the trail to help keep people on the trail. So you make a tread that is more acceptable to the user, and then you make the edge of the edge of the trail corridor unacceptable, and that's a way to keep people where we need them to be. Thank you all for being here this evening, and it looks like Scott's coming up, so I'll just say I'm happy to stick around for another couple minutes if anybody has any other questions.
I have one last question.
Yes.
I'll take the last one. All your years on the summits, tell us your funniest story, interaction, question.
Oh,
I know you have many.
oh man,
It's tough
That's really hard. That's a really, really hard
because you've had a lot of them.
I have had a lot of crazy things on the summits over the years. Yeah, I mean, so I have seen, and I'll give two very quick stories. I have seen somebody play the tuba on the summit of Mount Marcy. That's a heavy object that you can't eat or drink or wear to bring up to the summit. But one of my stories, and I think this really encapsulates the experience of being a summit steward. I was leaving the summit of Mount Marcy, and it was, it had been a busy day. It had been a busy year. It had been the kind of year where, you'd seen all sorts of shenanigans on the summit of Mount Marcy. And there was a group, and I was chatting with them as I was heading down. And I thought, oh, is that a kite he's got on his back? And then I was like, no, it's just another guy with a samurai sword. And then I continued on, and it was only about a half mile later that I was like, another guy with a samurai sword. Yeah. Because that's what it's like. That's what it's like. So, thank you. I bet you can.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And one last time, very much, Rocky, thank you much to the Adirondack Council for sponsoring this lecture series. Thank you, everybody. Good night.